This is Basket Case Clubs, CPR Group's podcast where we turn basket case clubs into showcase clubs. Hello everyone and welcome back to Basket Case Clubs. I'm Michael Connolly from CPR Group, and as usual it is my pleasure to guide you through this journey of basket casey goodness as we continue our discussion of all things money. Joining me again is my brother Steve Connolly. G'day Steve, how you doing?
Hello. Gosh, I have missed you. It's been weeks. We're doing pretty well. We're on the recording train, and work is getting in the way, but I do very much look forward to the opportunity to sit down and talk basket casey goodness with you.
And sometimes basket casey badness.
And sometimes, well, look, if I'm honest, that's probably what I enjoy more. But it's then those stories of clubs that have turned things around to become great that we enjoy most.
Yes, yeah, and we certainly did a lot of basket casey badness last time when we talked about fraud and then safeguards to try and turn around those situations where it's happened. But it's always so disappointing. But something that I wanted to reflect on, because I don't think we made enough of a point of this, is, you know, how we kind of got shitty about how people can be so bad. I don't know if you remember the bloke who worked for that charity, I won't mention it, who ripped him off. I think he was the treasurer or director of finance, statewide association, ripped him off for $270,000. And at the time, I never met him. You had the pleasure or displeasure of meeting him and noticing some of the traits of, closed-mindedness and shadiness, and, oh no, don't worry about that, we've got that covered, it's all fine. And I'm glad that he went to jail for stealing $270,000 from that organization, a freaking charity. Come on, mate. Like, for people with disabilities, it's not okay.
It doesn't get any
money.
worse.
No.
It almost doesn't get any worse. And I remember vividly leaving that first meeting in which he was involved and calling you and saying, this guy's trouble. This organization has a problem. And sure enough, whatever it was, 6-9 months later, we hear that he was being charged.
And look, the fact that part of your read was that he'd said, no, we don't need no consultants looking over our shoulders. I wonder what was behind that, Steve.
It's always a red flag, isn't it? Whenever, and I think we talked through this, that whenever someone is at all reluctant to share what is actually public information, information that we could get directly from their regulatory authority.
In this case, the ACNC.
In that case, absolutely. And it always raises a red flag for us as soon as there's any hint of discomfort in sharing that information, that financial information.
Yep. Yeah. So look, I hope that our listeners have their blood boiling a little bit and going, yeah, that's right, they're arseholes and they should go to freaking jail. But I want to reflect for a minute on how bad these people's lives must be if they get to the point where they think this is okay. So remember that the trigger for a lot of people who commit fraud and literally steal money from volunteers in community associations, and sport is by no means immune. In fact, it's probably a riper target. A lot of the time it's addictions, and so they've got themselves to a point where they're looking for some way to get money to deal with an addiction, and quite often that is a gambling addiction. And I realise the circular argument here, and that's a lot of the gambling that happens in Australia is on sport, and it's people who get involved in sport to steal money to gamble in sport. So that you've got to have some compassion for the people who end up in that position to be able to do that. So I just wanted to reflect on that for a moment, because I think that it's something that is definitely worth considering. And while it's all well and good for you and I to sit up here in our nice, comfortable, gushy ivory tower and say, how dare those assholes, if you notice some of those signs early, there's a potential point of intervention. Now, it's not necessarily certainly not a sports club whose charter it is to offer support and addiction counselling for people. There is certainly a role that you can play in connecting people up with the right organisations who can offer that level of support. And especially for gambling addiction, it is something that exists, unfortunately, quite prevalently in Australia. And so there are support organisations available where help is available. So particularly if the people who potentially do have this issue are prepared to seek assistance because they don't want to steal the money, they're just finding themselves in a position of doing so, there is hope. There is a chance that you can help them. So that said, a little bit of compassion to overlay the mask of arseholeness that we talked about last time and certainly started this episode with. Let's talk about budgeting. So budgeting is, from my perspective, Steve, one of those things that is missed so often. And preparing for this, I thought, what's a question I can ask Steve? And one of the ones was, why do you think clubs are so shit at doing budgets?
Well, I think that the primary reason is that it's a case of the way they've always done it, and the way they've always done their financial management is for the treasurer, and if any or all of the other committee members have anything to do with the financial dealings of the organisation, they spend all of their time looking in the rearview mirror. So an analogy that we often use is when you get into your car and you compare the size of your windscreen and your rearview mirror, there's a huge difference, and the windscreen is far bigger for a very good reason, and that's because you should be spending a lot of your time, the vast majority of your time, looking where you're going. Your rearview mirror is there as an important little gauge to see where you've been and what's going on behind you. But in our experience, so many not-for-profit clubs, and certainly in the world of sport, they're no different. We see treasurers doing, post hoc reconciliation, trying to play catch up and get books ready for presentation of financial statements to the rest of the committee or to the auditor or accountant or the members at the AGM. And there's very little emphasis in many cases on looking at the rearview mirror and planning for where the organisation's going to be financially.
Looking at the windscreen, you mean?
What did I say?
Looking at the rearview mirror.
See, I'm falling victim to that mindset. Look at the windscreen.
We've been. Yeah.
So yes, look at the windscreen and have a really in-depth and strategic discussion about where the organisation should be in the future in a financial sense. So, but like I say, where I started with that answer and rambling, I really think it comes down to the fact that the current treasurer took over from the previous treasurer, and that treasurer didn't do much, if any, budgeting.
Yeah.
So it's a...
All right, so let me dig deeper and say, why do you reckon that treasurer didn't do any budgeting? Apart from obviously that it's cyclical and they also didn't.
Oh, because they get away with not?
Yep, nobody's holding them to account. There's no reporting that you need to do from a regulatory standpoint for budgeting.
And perhaps also because of that age-old mindset block, which is we are just a not-for-profit organisation.
Yep.
And also, of course, I think this underlying issue of the urgent stuff taking our attention away from the important stuff.
Yep.
So the stuff that is urgent, and if we don't focus on it today, will mean that our kids don't get out on the field with jerseys on their backs tomorrow, distracts us from the more strategic but very important matters such as budgeting.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly it, that it's just a focus on doing the stuff that sits under our noses for us to get done today, rather than the stuff that we should be doing to make our path easier for tomorrow. And really, it's just that, so we're too busy doing the doing to stop and do our strategic job. So this comes back to stuff that we talk about all the time, which is a failure to separate governance from operations. Now, operations are critical, and yes, operations is where urgency lives, and there are times when the entire committee is going to have to get involved, when there's an event, when there's a grant coming up, when there's a lease application that, well, the lease application is probably more strategic, and it is the sort of stuff that the entire committee should be involved with, but not necessarily buying sausages or cooking sausages in an event, or setting up flags or corner posts or nets or whatever for competition day. Now, those are all jobs that need to be done. But if it's the committee that is doing those jobs, what's the cost? And because, well, there is no cost. And by the way, there's no one else to do it. Yeah, I realize that. But the actual cost is that the job of the committee in going and making connections and building a stronger network with members and with visitors, that's the stuff that doesn't happen. So it's that strategic stuff that doesn't happen. And when you're spending every meeting talking about stuff that could be delegated to other people, like selection, like when a management committee is talking about selection, don't we have a selections committee? And isn't that the job of the coach or the coaching staff or coaching team, if they're volunteers, to do that? And why are we meddling in that? If you're not doing your job, then that's the job that nobody does, because then there's two people doing the selection job or two people doing the event organizing job and nobody doing the governance job. And budgeting is one of those forward-looking strategic elements of running a club that is just so often overlooked. So that's why it doesn't happen. Let's now take a look at what the benefits of good budgeting are. And for me, it's really, really simple. Like you said, you got your rear view mirror and your windscreen. your reporting that you do per period. So for the annual financial statements, that's for the financial year, or for your regular committee meetings, that could be a month. So often there's monthly committee meetings or thereabouts. It says, this is how we did last month. Now, quite often, in fact, I'd go out on a limb and say probably the main reason why when those financial reports are presented, there's very few questions that are asked, it is because that is simply a statement of fact. Now, obviously, so long as that's a statement of fact, so long as rewind and listen to the last episode and it's not a furphy or
Fabricated,
fabricated, photoshopped, all of those other F words. Photoshop. Isn't it funny that the word phonetic starts with a PH? God, stupid language. And that the word dyslexic is so nastily spelt for anyone who has trouble mixing their letters up. Like, that's just not fair. And the word lisp has an S in it. Like, seriously. What a stupid language. Oh. So yes, you can Photoshop things and then they're a falsified, fraudulent furphy. So long as we are talking real accounts, it's just a statement of fact. It says last month or last year, we did this much. So we made this much and we spent this much. So let's take Canteen, for instance. We spent this much and we made this much from Canteen trade. Everyone can look at that and go, any questions? No, we made that much. We spent that much. Move on. Yet, so that really misses the point. If you've got a budget, then the really valuable thing that you can do in every line item is a comparison of budget to actuals. What that does then is it gives you a story. When you've got a number, you've got a number. It's a fact. That's all. You've got a fact. But when you've got a number that says this is where we are and another number that says this is where we predicted to be, if those numbers are the same, there's a story. That story is our calculations were right, and we are where we expected to be because we did the things that we were going to do. Let's say that our gross profit from trading in the canteen was lower than budgeted, so we didn't make as much money as we expected to from that business unit. Then we've got two numbers that are out of kilter and we can ask questions. So we expected to make this much and we actually made this much, which is $1,000 less. And then what's the simple question that everyone can ask? Why is that? Why did we
fall short?
Yeah. What did we not do that we thought we would do? Or what changed to influence this? And it could be very simple. We might have had a washout. Okay, there's the story. The reason that we're $1,000 short is that we had a washout. Great, that explains the story. Or if we made more than we expected, then we can say, what did we do that worked so well? Did we change up the menu? Did we change up the pricing strategy? Did we change our supplier so that we now can buy cheaper? Again, that's the story, because then you can say, and this is how having a budget means that the committee discussions that you're having become so much more valuable, because you're starting to say, hey, this was good stuff. What have we done that was good that we can do more of? And what have we done that didn't work that we need to do less of and replace? So that's why it's so valuable to do budgeting.
Just as you were talking there about that comparison of budget versus actuals, I wonder if, I'm sure that this is certainly the case in some clubs, some committees, some people's minds, but I wonder if there's this subconscious reluctance to do the budgeting because then a comparison can be made against where we thought we would be. And in some clubs, you know, there would understandably be treasurers and other committee members who might be reluctant to be questioned in that regard at general meetings. And of course, the majority of sporting clubs out there have got great cultures and, you know, members and committees. The committees are the members, so you know, they all get along really well, but there are certainly instances, and unfortunately it's often where we're exposed to clubs that, you know, members are asking pointed questions of committees. Yeah, that's right. And yeah, committees asking us for guidance through that. So I just wonder if there might be an element of that in some instances.
So what you're saying, Steve, is that there's an underlying aversion to accountability?
Definitely. Yep.
Yeah, look,
I don't like being accountable when I've fallen short in some area, you know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, if we were a psychology podcast, we'd probably be able to delve into that and look for the underlying reasons why there's an aversion to accountability. In fact, we should trademark that, accountability aversion. We could write a whole book about it. You know what? We can. How many steps will it take to fix it? The first step, Fixing your accountability aversion is admitting to yourself that you have an accountability aversion. And in fact,
It's being accountable, yeah.
that's
Oh, wait, that's
probably
the last step too.
yeah, no, that's isn't it? That's helping somebody else. I think that the main reason that that exists may be subconscious, and it's like no. I'm happy to be,
Yeah.
and you look at how many clubs want to have transparency as a value, and of course, when we talked about values, we said if you're not, if you don't operate with integrity and honesty and transparency, why are you in business in the first place, and
Yep.
what have you been doing up until now? But it's more that no, we're happy to be to have transparency, but it's this underlying subconscious aversion to accountability because it takes extra work. I think that's the main thing. To do a budget and report against the budget takes extra work. But just again, rewind a little bit and listen to how valuable that is. And it means that when you're in your committee meetings having discussions about the financials, it's discussions that help a club to get better. Not just does anyone have a question? Oh, have you put the wrong input code there in the general ledger, so that is in the wrong place? No. That's okay. That's an administrative oversight or an error that doesn't make a difference. But if you're then having a discussion about pricing strategies and supplier networks and what you're stocking and what you're doing, then those are great governance discussions that a committee should be having. That again, you can't have if you don't do that level of reporting that says, let's make some predictions here.
Yep. Completely agree.
So there we go. Why it doesn't happen, why it's good for it to happen. And now let's talk about how to make it happen. So there's two types of budgeting that I want to talk about. And of these, you can pick the easiest or you can pick the right one if you like. And the reason that I say that like that a little bit tongue in cheek is that doing the second one probably gives you a better result, but it is more complicated and is harder to do, especially the first time. So the easiest way to budget is just to have a look over what we've got from last time and say last financial year, and let's just continue on. And you should do this business unit by business unit. So it gets more complicated. I remember one of the best budgets that I did see was in Surf Lifesaving Club, where there's the different operational units, so the cadets and the juniors and the surf sports, and they had separate budgets for each of those business units, which is great because it means that if you head up one of those teams, you know what you've got to be able to spend for the year in certain areas. And so that pre-approval of the budget also meets the approval process, the requirement for any incorporated association that says that expenditure must be approved by the management committee or board. That's the way that can happen. If we know that we're going to have to spend 12 grand this year on electricity or thereabouts, and how do we know that? Because we looked at last year, and last year was about 10 grand, and we're expecting increases in electricity expenditure. Then that in effect is the approval of our expenditure to the payment of those bills. So once those electricity bills come in, so long as they're within that 12 grand for the year, we don't actually need to go and get separate approval for those. It's then all in the financial reporting that happens at the meetings. It says this is what we expected to spend in the month for electricity, and this is what we did spend. Great, they're within QE. Or it's less, so that's fantastic. And if it's more, then what's going on, price increase, and that's fine. So the easiest way to do a budget is simply look at last year, look at each of the line items, and say, okay, so that's where we were last year. What do we think is going to change this year? Is that expense item too high because we had some unusual expenses that year, and so we can budget for less expenditure, or is that a line item like food purchases, for instance, and the cost of food goes up at least with inflation, so we can increase that at least at the current rate of inflation, or even if you're just spitballing and saying that in Australia the RBA's target band is 2% and 4% or whatever it is, and said let's just go 3% in the middle of that. And so that's an easy way to do budgeting. It's positive because it's based in fact. We know that that's what we spent, and we know that that's what we earned, and so we can say, okay, that's a reasonable assumption. You should not only budget for expenses, though you should also be budgeting for income. And this is sometimes where clubs particularly fall down. They do a good enough job of budgeting for expenses, those that do budget, but they don't budget for income. And so income's the other side of the ledger. And we should be saying, okay, so what can we make? Is that the right area? Is that, are we in the right ballpark here for how much money we should be making in each of these business units?
Yep. And it can, I think that in my experience, you might have a different experience, but this is the most common budgeting that when I do see a club doing budgeting, this is the most common approach that I see them take. Has your experience been the same?
Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, for the vast majority. The reason that I'm struggling a little bit is because the pool of clubs that do good budgeting is pretty slim pickings to
Yeah.
begin with.
Yeah.
So this is probably then a good point to segue into the other way to do budgeting, which is called zero-based budgeting. Now, the reason that this is more of a challenge, but probably gives you a better result, is that it gives you a chance to have critical oversight to everything that you're spending and to everything that you're making. So the great question to ask yourself is, and let's take the income side because it's probably the more difficult. If we weren't doing this business unit, would we start doing it now? That's the question. And it takes some serious soul searching. And again, it's one of those difficult questions that we subconsciously avoid because it's far easier to say who's setting up the fields on the weekend or
Yep.
how much is our contractor charging us for mowing. So when you take that approach, you're critically analyzing to say, we expect to make this much money from sale of merchandise. Do we have the sort of club where merchandise is a profitable business unit? Or are we running a merchandise arm of a merchandise operation purely to generate club spirit and pride in our brand and our colors? Again, that's fine, but that's the discussion that you should be having. Not just we made 5,000 from merch last year, so let's say make it 5,200. That's what we'll
Mm.
budget. Or you might say, well, actually, we've got a real untapped market for merchandise here. We're just spitballing here, Steve. We're a winter sport, and so it gets cold in the middle of winter. Yet we don't have any scarves. What if we could sell scarves for our parents, even on a training night, to say, hey, when you come down the club, wear your scarf. And now again, still spitballing. You say every Tuesday night, biggest training night, there'll be a random draw for everyone who's wearing a scarf. One person will get a voucher for so many dollars at the canteen or something. So that encourages them to wear the scarf, which hey encourages them to buy the scarf. And with the changes in merch when I started in this job too many years ago that I'm going to admit online, um, which you can probably see if you go and read it. It was 26 and something years ago when I started. The supply chain was very different. If you wanted merch
Yeah.
and you wanted it to be affordable, you needed to buy a lot of
It was
scarves.
a risk. Yep.
Yeah, so that stock holding is a significant risk. Now you can have one in stock and you can have them made to order. Now the price per unit may be a little higher, but your holding costs are so much lower that it actually makes it worthwhile. Plus, if you're doing a good job of marketing yourself, then buying a club scarf is something that people want to do anyway. So there's intrinsic value in that.
But even
So
this discussion about supply chain and sourcing the greatest mix of product quality versus cost is a discussion that so many clubs will never have because they're busy with the urgent stuff.
exactly, yeah, yeah. So and that's
And the
why
budgeting discussion might force you down that path or might encourage those sorts of outside the box discussions.
and it's probably more likely to happen with a zero-based budgeting approach.
Okay.
However, you can do both. You can kind of just have a hybrid approach and say, well, this is what we did last year. So if we weren't doing merch, would we start it now? Well, yes, and then still go down the path of saying, well, what could we make, and doing more of analysis. But then if you say we made 5 grand last year, just a traditional approach to budgeting might say we're going to make budget for 5.2, 5.3, 10%, 5.5 this year. Oh, 10%. Oh, that's a stretch. Bollocks, it's a stretch. It's just inflation and the fact that you should be charging a bit more anyway. If you then say, no, let's go for 10, let's make 10 grand, then you're having a discussion to say, well, what other merchandise should we be doing here? But again, to take a good governance approach, this is not necessarily a discussion that the entire management committee needs to be involved in. This can then say, well, actually, there's good potential here. We can delegate working out our merchandise budget to a person who's in control. So one person, volunteer, or even a paid person, to go and investigate what we might be able to do, or a subcommittee and say, let's have a merchandise subcommittee. And that could be a shared responsibility because, merchandise considerations only happens a little bit. So it might be the same subcommittee that looks after other fundraising ventures as well. So it might be a fundraising subcommittee. Again, spitballing, and there's no one right way to do this. But you're then delegating that discussion to a group of people whose sole job it is to say, hey, management committee, here's some ideas and here's what we think we can make if we take these additional business risks. So, and again, this could be part of the accountability aversion. Is it does actually mean we've got to understand our risk appetite from a financial perspective to be able to have clarity for ourselves as to where we want to go and how much we want to make and where we want to go from a business perspective and a business unit perspective and how much we want to make from each of those.
And again, to reflect on a discussion from last week or the week before, that highlights how critical it is for all committee members to have a really good, deep understanding of the organisation's financial situation, not just the treasurer, because otherwise those decisions can't be well informed.
Yeah. I'm glad we had this discussion, Steve. It's been a very interesting little journey down that we wouldn't have had that journey if we weren't talking about budgeting. So it's this whole discussion about scarves on the sideline for a winter sport and a voucher for somebody wearing a scarf. Like, these are tiny little simple things that you can do, but you're only going to get to these sorts of really exciting, proper leadership governance strategy, as in the role of the management committee type jobs, discussions, if you're not having a trigger to do it. And why not let budgeting be that trigger? Because it's so linked to strategy. You shouldn't have a strategy that says we're going to be able to run these programs and offer these scholarships and build this Taj Mahal and buy all this new equipment if we can't back that up by having a budget that says, oh, by the way, this is the way that we're going to have some business viability that means that we can do this.
And that term you just used, in business viability, points to a thought that I was just having then as you were speaking, which is this really is just founded in clubs running their organisations as the businesses that they are. And these sorts of discussions about incentives or bundling of meals in kiosks and so on in a commercial setting are discussions that happen frequently because there's a profit incentive or imperative rather for running that business, whereas because of the very nature of these clubs being not for profit, often that good business thinking just doesn't get applied, and it's not through any fault of any individuals, it's just because of the mindset that they've got when they take their positions on. And it takes nerds like us to challenge those mindsets and encourage decision makers to think a bit differently. But I completely agree that when it comes to good, well-informed business decision making, budgeting is a really important pillar that is all too often overlooked.
Yep. All very exciting. So I think we should stop there purely because we could actually get into probably a day and a half non-stop discussion about,
as is always the case,
about what sort of opportunities exist. So use this as a thought provoker and a trigger. So the examples we've given, take these to your committee and say, what changes do we need to make to be able to do this? And it might be before you can get to the point of doing a budgeting, especially when you're using it as a strategic discussion like we're talking about, is what is it that we're doing as a management committee leadership group that we shouldn't be doing, that we need to actually spend some time going and finding other people to help with this work so that it enables us to do that job. So that might be the first step that you've got to take. And then you get into it and you're looking at the financials from last year and trying to identify what your business units are. And even like the surf club example, even within the sport that we offer, are there different cohorts of juniors and seniors, masters? Do you have different areas that you can create budgets for separately before you then look into the non-core business units that you're also running in support of your main business unit, which is the purpose that we exist, which is whatever sport that we were built to run?
Oh, and again, having those discussions is the only way that you're going to uncover the potential that lies in those different business units. And while they might not be your core business, they may well be helping in a significant way to prop up your business so that you can deliver your core business.
Absolutely. And as we're going to talk about when we're talking about making money, that doesn't mean to put downward pressure on fees. Your fees are your fees, and they should be set where they're set based on the value that you provide to your members, not based on the fact that you're working your asses off in other business units to subsidise the assholes who won't volunteer and do any work. But we'll save that for a future episode, won't we?
We shall stay off our soapbox temporarily.
Temporarily, yes. Boom, there we go. Feet firmly planted on the floor. Steve, thank you very much again for this enlightening discussion about all things money. And it's not all things money. It's specifically the budgeting part of money and the different rabbit warrens that it can lead you down.
Thank you for the opportunity to listen to your ramblings and do some of my own.
Thank you, of course, to Jess, our wonderful editor and producer. And by the time you listen to this, there's probably lots of inappropriate stuff that she has very accurately cut out and then shared with us in the little internal blooper reel that makes us both piss ourselves laughing. If you're not already subscribed to our newsletter, make sure you do that at cprgroup.com.au, where we share lots of tips like this and little bits and pieces from a marketing perspective, from a branding perspective, from a making more money perspective, from a business unit perspective. Follow us on all of the social channels where you normally get your information. And I think that's just about it for now, Steve. I look forward to continuing our financial management discussions next time.
As will I. Catch you then.
Bye.
Basket Case Clubs acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country on which we record, being Yugambeh, Turrbal, Jagera and Kabi Kabi land. We recognise their enduring connection to land, waters and culture, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to First Nations listeners.